Welcome to Book Insider. Today, we're going to talk about The Art of Logic by Eugenia Cheng. Amelia had always been fond of reading, but today she was feeling something different. In her hands was a new book, The Art of Logic, How to Make Sense in a World That Doesn't, which she had ordered online last week. This book wasn't just about eugenics or numbers. It opened the door to an entirely different world of thinking and understanding. The cover was simple, yet it had a strange charm that seemed to call out to her. It was a Sunday morning, slightly chilly outside. Amelia picked up her favorite cup of coffee and settled into the cozy chair in her balcony. She often said that the right atmosphere was essential for a good book. As she looked out at the trees and the cityscape beyond, she opened the first page of the book. The first chapter was Understanding the Nature of Logic. At first, she thought to herself, logic? Isn't that just some kind of mental exercise? But as she started reading, she realized that this chapter was about to change her entire way of thinking. Eugenia Cheng explained that logic isn't confined to numbers or mathematics. It's a method we can use to analyze any argument. This reminded Amelia of her college days when she and her friend Clara were discussing gender equality. Clara believed that society could never be completely equal, while Amelia tried to explain that change always begins with small steps. However, both were stubbornly holding on to their points. The book taught that logic is about asking questions. Amelia thought, if I had focused on asking Clara questions instead of just trying to prove my point, maybe our conversation could have been deeper. Chung wrote that logic gives us the power to think beyond reality, so we can see any issue clearly and objectively. One line stood out to Amelia. Logic allows us to abstract reality, so we can focus on what's important without getting lost in irrelevant details. This line echoed in her mind. How often do arguments get derailed by irrelevant points, causing us to lose sight of the main issue? She asked herself, have I ever thought about why someone disagrees with me during a debate? Have I truly tried to understand their perspective? The answer more often than not was no. Amelia realized something profound. Winning an argument isn't as important as understanding the other person's perspective. One part of the book particularly shook her when Chung wrote that using logic equips us to have meaningful discussions on controversial topics like gender equality or racism. Amelia reflected on how, these days, people on social media often attack each other thoughtlessly, leading to debates that achieve nothing. Perhaps this happens because people treat their feelings as the absolute truth. Lost in her thoughts, Amelia didn't even notice her coffee had gone cold. A question came to her mind. If logic advises us to distance ourselves from reality, does that mean we should stop being practical? She answered herself, not exactly. It means we should adopt a neutral perspective to look at any problem objectively. She imagined how she could use logic in the future, perhaps during a heated office meeting. Maybe I should try to understand everyone's perspective rather than insisting that my opinion is the most important, she thought. The book further explained that one of the greatest advantages of logic is that it helps us avoid emotional bias. Often, when we're emotionally attached to something, we end up believing in irrelevant or incorrect arguments. Amelia remembered watching a movie last month where the main character based every major decision solely on emotions, leading to a life in shambles. She wondered, could that character's life have been better if they had incorporated logic into their decisions? By this point, she was still on the first chapter of the book, but her thoughts were racing, and she felt as though her capacity to think had expanded. Gently closing the book, she gazed outside at the trees, her eyes fixed on the view beyond the window, while her mind lingered on the book's words. If I can apply these concepts to my life, she thought, maybe I'll understand many things better. Things I've only been looking at one-sidedly until now. She grabbed her phone and started jotting down notes. Logic is about asking the right questions, not just giving the right answers. Avoid emotional bias when analyzing important decisions. Try to understand others' perspectives before forming an opinion. This was the third point Amelia noted for herself to apply in her daily life. But this was just the beginning. She realized this book wasn't just teaching her about logic, but also about understanding herself better. If you liked our free summary, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or support us via UPI. Now back to the summary. Amelia decided that the next day at work, she would do a small experiment by incorporating logic into her discussions. She felt this book wasn't just meant to be read but lived. This is just the first lesson, she told herself. Who knows what more there is to learn? The next day began like any other. The same rush to get to work, the same routine tasks. But Amelia couldn't stop thinking about the book and the lessons from its first chapter. She reflected, I need to start thinking in a more organized way. The day was packed with meetings and emails, but as soon as she got home that evening, she made herself a cup of her favorite tea and reopened the book. Today's lesson was about the directionality of logic. The chapter began with a simple idea. Logic flows in one direction. It seemed easy to grasp, but as Amelia read further, she realized it wasn't as simple as it sounded. Cheng explained how misunderstanding this one-directional flow often leads to major misconceptions. One example from the book caught her attention. If someone says all bananas are fruits, that's correct. But saying all fruits are bananas? That's obviously wrong. Amelia laughed at how obvious it seemed, yet noted how often people make similar mistakes in reasoning. Reflecting on her life, she remembered an incident from last week at the office. Her boss had said, employees who are punctual are good employees. Amelia had immediately thought, I'm punctual, so I must be a good employee. But now she realized the flaw in that logic. Just because punctual employees are good doesn't necessarily mean every punctual person excels in their role. The book pointed out how people often fail to analyze logical structures correctly, which leads to arguments taking a wrong turn. Misinterpreting logical directionality, or assuming if A implies B, then B implies A, is one of the biggest mistakes in reasoning. Amelia said to herself, how many times have I thought that if someone disagrees with me, they must be wrong? But maybe they're just looking at things differently from their perspective. She realized she needed to incorporate this concept into her reasoning. The book included another example that Amelia found quite fascinating. Cheng wrote, if someone is a musician, they are likely to be creative. But this doesn't mean every creative person is a musician. Amelia thought about how relatable this was. She recalled how many times she had fallen into similar misunderstandings. Just last month, her friend Ryan had told her that he meditated regularly. Amelia immediately assumed Ryan must be mentally sorted. But later, when she saw Ryan struggling with stress, she realized she had judged him based on just one trait. The book explained that ignoring the directionality of logic can lead to assumptions about people, which is often the root of misunderstandings. Amelia closed the book and reflected. If I pay attention to whether my reasoning is going in the right direction for every decision in life, I might be able to make better choices. She remembered another instance involving her neighbor, Mrs. Nora, who always seemed very organized. Everything in its place, perfectly pressed clothes, and an impeccable sense of time management. Amelia had always assumed Mrs. Nora's life must be completely sorted. But one day, Mrs. Nora shared how difficult her married life had been. Amelia was shocked. She realized she had made the same mistake, assuming B implies A. Just because someone looks organized externally doesn't mean they are internally sorted. In the next part of the book, Cheng discussed how the misuse of directional logic is often used to manipulate people's emotions. For example, if someone says, if you love me, you'll do everything I say, this is a logical fallacy. Loving someone and following all their commands are two entirely different things. Yet, people often connect them through directional logic and fall victim to emotional manipulation. As Amelia read this, she couldn't help but think about an old relationship of hers. She realized how many times she had encountered manipulative logic like this. She wondered, if I had known about this concept of directional logic back then, maybe I could have been emotionally stronger. She reread that section of the book multiple times. Cheng had also illustrated this idea with an example of categories, which further deepened Amelia's understanding. All fruits can be categorized, but that doesn't mean every category will only contain fruits. Amelia realized that this concept also applies to debates and discussions. People often take one incident and apply it to an entire group. She reminded herself to avoid generalizations the next time she discusses any topic. By now, the chapter had completely absorbed Amelia. She was trying to connect every example to her own life. She thought about how this second lesson on logic was giving her a new perspective on how she thinks. She closed the book for a moment and wondered how she could practically apply it in her daily life. She created a new note on her phone. Don't assume that if A implies B, then B also implies A. Avoid making assumptions about people based on a single trait. Recognize manipulative arguments based on faulty logic. As she wrote this, she felt a new sense of clarity. It was as if her thought process had reached a new level. Amelia now understood that this book wasn't just something to read. It was inspiring her to repeatedly question her decisions and assumptions. She decided that in her next discussion with her friends, she would consciously apply this lesson. She told herself, before making any decision, I need to pause and ask, am I thinking in the right direction, or am I trapped in a web of assumptions? So far, the book wasn't just a tool for learning. It had become a way to reshape her life. She realized that understanding logic didn't just improve arguments. It also enhanced relationships, decisions, and her overall thinking process. She reached out to turn the next page, but stopped herself. Not yet, she thought. I need to absorb this lesson first. She closed the book and looked outside. It was a moonlit night, and the air was cool, but Amelia's mind felt warm with a new perspective. A new way of thinking. She promised herself that she would make every lesson from this book a part of her life. This was just the beginning. The next morning, when Amelia reopened the book, she felt a strange excitement. The past 2 lessons had already transformed her way of thinking. She wondered what today's lesson would teach her. Taking her first sip of coffee, she began reading Chapter 3, The Role of Logic. Logic and emotions are not opposites, the book stated. If used correctly, they can complement each other. Amelia scratched her head after reading this line. She thought logic and emotions? Aren't they always considered separate? Logic is cold and practical, while emotions are all about feelings. Amelia had promised herself to approach every lesson in this book with an open mind. As she continued reading, she realized that Cheng was actually trying to say that ignoring emotions is a type of logical mistake. If we completely exclude emotions from discussions, we miss the chance to understand the perspectives of the people we're talking to. Cheng emphasized that when discussing sensitive topics like privilege or discrimination, it's crucial to consider emotions. These are issues where people's personal experiences and feelings play a significant role, and dismissing them could lead to meaningless discussions. Amelia was reminded of an incident from last month. During a meeting at her office about diversity and inclusion, a woman named Sarah shared her personal experiences of facing bias as a female employee. At the time, some people dismissed her feelings, saying, "This happens to everyone." But now Amelia realized that ignoring Sarah's emotions had been a huge mistake. If they had truly listened to her and tried to understand her feelings, the discussion could have been far more constructive. Cheng explained in the book that emotions help us understand the impact an issue has on people. Until we acknowledge this impact, we cannot fully grasp the problem. Amelia thought to herself, if I learn to balance logic and emotions, maybe I can become a better communicator. To make the concept clearer, Cheng gave an interesting example. She wrote that if someone tells you they are shivering in the cold, you shouldn't simply say, the temperature is 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not too bad. Instead, acknowledging their discomfort by saying, I'm sorry you're feeling cold. Let me get you a blanket, shows empathy while remaining practical. This blend of logic and emotions struck a chord with Amelia. She realized it wasn't just about being logical or emotional, but knowing when and how to use both. When someone says they're cold, simply giving a logical solution like, wear a sweater, is not enough. The issue of feeling cold isn't just about practical solutions. It's also about empathy. Validating the other person's feelings is just as important. Amelia found this idea deeply impactful. She realized that, in the past, she too had often ignored others' emotions during discussions. She focused solely on logical solutions and forgot how essential it is to acknowledge the emotions of the person in front of her. As she read further, Cheng explained that striking the right balance between logic and emotions helps bring people to common ground. This resonated deeply with Amelia. She thought, whenever I disagree with someone, I always focus on proving myself right. But if I start considering their feelings, the tone of the disagreement might change completely. One particularly interesting point Cheng made in the book was that emotions, if not handled properly, can derail discussions. However, if we use them effectively, they can enrich conversations. Amelia remembered a time when her friend Kevin had told her he was unhappy with his job. Back then, she had given him a practical suggestion, just look for a new job. Later, Kevin told her that it felt like she hadn't truly understood his feelings. Amelia realized how important it is to acknowledge emotions first, especially when discussing sensitive topics, and only then apply logic. She decided that the next time a friend or colleague shared their feelings, she would first try to understand their emotions before responding with solutions. Cheng also mentioned in this chapter that combining emotions and logic, rather than viewing them as separate, can lead to more empathetic and effective discussions. Inspired by this, Amelia thought about how she could apply it in her life. She opened her phone and wrote down these notes. Acknowledge emotions before jumping to logical solutions. Balance emotions and logic to create empathetic communication. Use emotions to understand the impact of an issue on others. She felt these notes would help her improve her communication and relationships. Chung provided another example of how to make discussions on sensitive topics like privilege and discrimination more meaningful. By recognizing the emotions tied to these issues and then applying logic, discussions could become not only more constructive but also more inclusive. This approach, Amelia realized, was the key to having impactful and empathetic conversations. Chung explained that when a privileged person is told they can't understand discrimination, they often become defensive. However, if it's framed differently, for example, by explaining that privilege means they haven't experienced certain struggles, it opens the door to a more open-minded conversation. This perspective deeply resonated with Amelia. She realized that she, too, had often been judgmental about others' privilege. Determined to change, she decided to adopt this new perspective and approach discussions with more empathy and constructiveness. Closing the book, she took a deep breath. That day's lesson struck her profoundly. She understood that balancing logic and emotions doesn't just improve discussions. It strengthens relationships, too. Amelia made a promise to herself. She would apply this lesson in her life. She thought, "This book isn't just teaching me a new way to think. It's helping me become a better person." The next morning felt different. The cool breeze flowed in through the window as she sipped her tea. Reflecting on the past 3 evenings, Amelia felt as though her mind had taken a new direction. Each lesson had taught her to analyze her thoughts more deeply. Today, she was excited to dive into the 4th lesson. Opening the book, she began reading a chapter titled Recognizing the Limits of Logic. This time, Chung focused on a different angle. Logic, while powerful, is also limited. It can't resolve every situation because disagreements often arise not just from reasoning, but from differing starting points or premises. As Amelia read this, she was reminded of an argument she had had some time ago. A group chat with her college friends had turned into a heated discussion. The topic was whether success is solely the result of hard work or if luck plays a role as well. Amelia had passionately argued that hard work is everything. She had backed up her stance with numerous examples, including her father's story of rising from a small town to achieving great success in the city. But her friend Ryan had countered with arguments in favor of luck. He insisted that timing and opportunities also play a crucial role. The debate had gone on for hours, with both sides refusing to budge. Now, as Amelia read Cheng's perspective, she realized the real issue wasn't the reasoning itself. The problem lay in the different premises from which she and Ryan were approaching the discussion. She began to understand that logic alone cannot bridge such gaps. This realization encouraged Amelia to rethink how she handled disagreements. She decided that, moving forward, she would focus not only on presenting her reasoning, but also on understanding others' starting points and perspectives. This, she believed, would lead to more meaningful and enriching discussions. The issue wasn't with their logic, but with their starting points. Chung explained that if 2 people begin from different premises, their conclusions will differ. Amelia thought back to her debate with Ryan. Perhaps, she realized, the logic wasn't wrong in their discussion. Both of them had valid arguments to support their points, but they weren't standing on common ground. Chung emphasized in the book that to truly understand disagreements, it's essential to recognize the premises of the other person. Without that, you'll just continue to argue from your own logic. Amelia found this idea so practical that she immediately took out her notebook and wrote down before argument identification. Chung also made another insightful point. Logic has its limitations because it cannot fully address emotions or values. No matter how correct your logical reasoning might be, if the other person's values or priorities differ, they won't agree with you. Amelia connected this with an incident at her office. Once, her team was debating a project's outcome. The discussion was whether customer satisfaction or profit margins were more important. Some team members emphasized profit, while others felt customer satisfaction should take precedence. Amelia now realized that the real issue in that debate wasn't the logic. It was the difference in values and priorities. Chung suggested that to resolve disagreements, it's crucial to view reasoning from the other person's perspective. If we understand where the other person is coming from, we can present our arguments in a more compelling way. Amelia promised herself that in the future, she would focus not only on presenting her arguments, but also on trying to understand the other person's perspective. Chung also pointed out that acknowledging the limitations of logic isn't a weakness, it's a strength. Accepting that logic can't solve every problem allows us to approach discussions with more openness and empathy. This thought gave Amelia a new sense of clarity. She realized that she often fought to prove her point in arguments, but now she understood that the goal of discussions should not be to win, but to truly understand one another. In the next section of the book, Chung provided another example from the world of mathematics, where logic is paramount. Even in mathematics, disagreements can arise if two mathematicians start with different axioms. Their proofs and results will be based on different foundations, leading to divergent conclusions. If disagreements can happen in fields like mathematics, then why wouldn't they happen in human relationships and discussions? Amelia thought to herself. As soon as she read this line, she made a promise to herself. The next time she had a disagreement with someone, she would think about where that person's starting point was. So far, the book had given her so many insights that were shifting her thinking in new directions. She realized that understanding the limitations of logic could make her a better person. She closed the book and paused for a moment. All the lessons she had learned were swirling in her mind. She felt that each lesson was not just teaching her about logic, but also about herself. The next morning, with a gentle chill in the air and the warmth of her tea, Amelia sat by the window and opened the book. All the lessons so far had changed her ability to think and understand. With each chapter, she was getting to know herself on a deeper level. Today's lesson was about the importance of abstraction and analogy. She wondered what new concept she would learn today and began reading. Chung defined abstraction and analogy. She wrote that when a problem becomes too complex, abstraction, seeing the problem in a simplified version, provides clarity. On the other hand, analogy, comparing a problem to another similar situation, helps us find connections between different circumstances. Amelia read this line and thought, I should apply this to every aspect of my life. Chung explained that abstraction helps when we focus on patterns and structures instead of specific numbers. For instance, the concept of addition isn't limited to numbers. It can be applied to things like oranges or even ideas. Amelia tried to understand this in her own context. She remembered a conversation she had a few days ago with her friend Ryan, who was feeling confused about his career decisions. He said, I don't know whether I should pursue an MBA, change jobs, or something else. At that time, Amelia hadn't properly understood his problem. But now she realized that if she had viewed Ryan's issue through abstraction and analogy, it might have helped her provide more clarity. In the book, Chung mentioned that abstraction prevents us from getting tangled in details. When we step back from a complex situation and try to understand its core problem, solutions start becoming clearer. Amelia connected this with an incident at her office. Her team was working on a large client project, but everyone in the team was so tangled in small details that the main goal of the project was getting lost. If they had applied abstraction at that moment and understood the broader perspective of the project, maybe the team would have felt less stressed. The book also deeply explored analogy. Chung wrote that analogy makes things easier to understand. She explained that when we relate an unfamiliar concept to a familiar example, people can grasp things more quickly. Amelia immediately remembered an incident from college. She used to help her roommate, Natalie, with her studies. Natalie had trouble with math and was always afraid she wouldn't understand the equations. Once, Amelia explained quadratic equations using the analogy of a plant's growth cycle. Roots like seeds and solutions like fully grown plants. She remembered that after that analogy, Natalie started understanding quadratic equations. And now, while reading the book, Amelia realized that she was unknowingly applying abstraction at that time. Chung also explained that abstract logic not only helps in understanding, but also enhances emotional engagement. When we make an issue relatable, people not only understand it logically, but also connect with it emotionally. Amelia thought about how she could apply this in her conversations with friends and colleagues. She noted that to simplify a complex problem, focus on the core issue, use analogy to make unfamiliar ideas relatable and engaging, and relate abstract principles to real-world situations for better understanding. Chung gave an example of how abstraction and analogy can make discussions on sensitive topics easier. She explained privilege by comparing it to an escalator. Privilege is like being on an escalator, while others have to climb stairs. This analogy helps people better understand the concept of privilege. This analogy deeply impacted Amelia. She thought that if she used analogies in this way, she could make difficult discussions more effective. She remembered a recent conversation she had with her friend Emily, who didn't believe feminism was necessary because equality already existed in the world. Amelia hadn't been able to explain things properly at that time, but now she thought, if I had explained feminism using a simple analogy, Emily might have understood better. Cheng mentioned that abstraction and analogy are tools to enrich discussions. She wrote that when people can relate to a concept emotionally through analogy, it helps bridge the gap in understanding. When we don't fully understand a concept, direct arguments can make people defensive. But if we use analogy, they try to see things from our perspective. Amelia realized something important. Many times, when she was in an argument, she felt the other person wasn't even trying to understand her. But now, she understood that maybe she wasn't presenting her point in the right way. She learned another important lesson from the book. Abstraction and analogy aren't just ways to simplify problems. They're bridges that connect people from different perspectives. At the end of the chapter, Cheng wrote that when used correctly, abstraction and analogy not only make logical discussions easier, but also add depth and understanding. Amelia closed the book and looked out the window. The soft sunlight was falling on her face. She realized that this book wasn't just teaching her new concepts. It was also making her a better person. She thought to herself, next time I have a conversation, I will definitely use abstraction and analogy, and maybe my points will become more meaningful and relatable. As she felt the gentle sunlight coming through the window, Amelia closed the book. All the lessons had taught her not only how to understand logic, but also how to apply it in her life. She realized that abstraction and analogy had given her a new perspective on how to connect with people in a better way. She promised herself that the next time there was a debate or discussion, she would present her point not just with logic, but also with relatable examples and empathy. She looked at her notes and smiled. Every lesson is making me better, she thought. Her journey wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a new phase. Her destination was no longer just understanding. It was about sharing her knowledge with those around her. Amelia placed the book on her table and started her day with renewed hope. So friends, this was our book summary for today. Let me know what you think in the comments, and thank you for listening to the summary till the end.